The rain had not stopped for 3 days on Deathworld 9. Every drop hissed when it touched the soil, as if the planet itself was alive and angry. The jungle was thick and dark, filled with sounds that no one could name. 12 explorers had landed there, their boots sinking into mud that smelled like metal and rot. They came to study the ecosystem, to collect samples for the Galactic Council. None of them expected war. Among them was one human, Lieutenant Mason Rourke. He wasn't the leader, just a security officer. The others were aliens, strong, proud, and armed with scanners and plasma rifles. They laughed at him on the first day. "Death worlds are made for us," said a Chlorian, his blue scales gleaming in the light. "Humans are too soft for places like this." Mason didn't argue. He simply checked his weapon and looked at the endless trees that seemed to breathe. By nightfall, 2 explorers were gone. The trackers showed movement, fast and erratic, vanishing deep into the forest. They searched until dawn, finding only torn equipment and strange claw marks burned into the ground. The Chlorian leader said it was a predator. Mason said it was something worse, something smart. The others ignored him. On the second day, the jungle grew louder. Massive shapes moved between the trees. Every leaf seemed to whisper. Mason watched shadows shift like living things. When they camped, he barely slept. The air itself felt wrong, too heavy, too alive. At dawn, they heard the screams. Another group member vanished, dragged into the undergrowth so fast, no one even fired. Mason grabbed his pulse rifle and shot into the trees, but his beam hit nothing but air. The ground shivered beneath them. Something big was circling, the aliens argued. The leader wanted to push forward. Mason wanted to retreat. "This planet is not natural," he said. "Something's hunting us." But pride ran deep in the aliens. They laughed again, calling him a coward. Mason didn't reply. He'd seen too many planets. Too many missions end the same way. Overconfidence first, silence later. By the 3rd day, half of them were gone. The camp was covered in fog, and the jungle floor was littered with bones, not from their group, but from creatures long dead. Mason studied one and saw strange cut marks. It wasn't teeth. It was tools. At night, he found a trail, a pattern of stones arranged in a circle. Inside, it lay bones, small ones, and something like a nest built from metal fragments. Whatever lived here wasn't just a beast. It built things. It planned. He returned to camp and found it empty. The fire still burned. The weapons lay on the ground. He called out their names, but only echoes answered. He turned slowly, feeling eyes on him from every direction. Then he saw movement, something huge, crawling low, its breath steaming in the cold air. Mason fired. The beam lit the trees for an instant, revealing a creature the size of a shuttle, fur glistening like oil, eyes glowing red. It didn't attack. It stared at him, curious, intelligent, and almost human in its gaze. Then it vanished into the mist. Mason backed toward the camp, heart pounding. He reloaded, checked his rations, and waited. But as the night dragged on, nothing came. The jungle was silent again, unnaturally so. When morning came, he saw footprints near the fire, massive ones, 4-clawed and deep. Next to them were bones of something freshly killed. And beside the bones, a chunk of fruit. The beast had brought him food. He didn't know why. Maybe it saw him as prey too weak to chase. Maybe as another hunter. Or maybe, somehow, it understood that he was alone. Mason decided to follow the tracks. He moved through the jungle, rifle raised, senses sharp. The deeper he went, the more he saw signs of intelligence. Sharpened stones, clawed marks in trees forming symbols, nests woven from vines and metal. The jungle wasn't wild. It was a kingdom, and something ruled it. He stopped by a small stream to rest, crouching to refill his canteen. That's when he heard it, a low growl behind him. Slowly he turned. The predator stood there again, silent, massive, its breath fogging the air. Its fur was matted with rain and blood, but its eyes glowed calm, steady. It dropped something at his feet, a piece of cooked meat. Mason froze. The creature waited. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Mason reached out, slowly, took the meat, and nodded once. The predator blinked, turned, and vanished back into the forest. For the first time, Mason smiled. Deathworld 9 wasn't a jungle, it was alive, thinking, testing him. and he had just passed the first test. When the rescue beacon finally flickered to life weeks later, only one human signal registered. The Galactic Council's recovery team expected to find remains. Instead, they found tracks, one human and one massive predator, leading away from a burned-out camp. The man who returned would not speak of what happened in the jungle, but those who saw him swore they saw something move in the shadows behind him, something with glowing red eyes, watching, protecting, waiting for his next command. The rescue ship never came. Weeks passed since the signal was sent, and Mason stopped counting the days. The jungle had its own time. Sunlight cut through the trees for a few hours, then the fog returned, thick as smoke. Food was never certain, and the nights were filled with glowing eyes. But Mason survived because the predator watched over him. He had given it a name: Brutus. It wasn't clever, but it fit. The creature followed him everywhere, silent as a shadow, hunting when Mason slept and guarding him when he moved. Its fur was dark brown, almost black, but shimmered blue under the alien sun. Its claws could tear through steel, yet when it took food from his hand, it did so gently. At first, Mason thought it was just instinct. Maybe Brutus saw him as part of its pack. But then things began to change. The creature started bringing him specific things: fruit, bones, and once, a broken transmitter from an alien suit. It understood value. It learned. One night, while sitting by the fire, Mason talked aloud. "You know, if they ever come for me, they'll call you a monster." Brutus raised its head, eyes reflecting the flames. "But you're smarter than most of them," Mason said quietly. The predator huffed, almost like laughter. The next morning, Mason found tracks near their camp. Not Brutus's, but something else. Smaller, lighter, and many of them. He crouched low, touching the prints. They weren't animals. They were made by hands. He followed them for hours, moving carefully through vines and roots. The air grew hotter, the sounds louder. Finally, he reached a clearing where the ground was black and scarred. Dozens of strange huts stood there, made from bones and metal parts. Around them moved thin, gray-skinned creatures with bright yellow eyes. They weren't the missing explorers. They were something native. Hunters. Intelligent. Mason stayed hidden. He counted at least 15 of them, each carrying spears tipped with glowing shards. At the center of the camp lay something wrapped in vines, a pile of bones, armor fragments, and a few human badges. His team. The aliens hadn't died from the jungle. They'd been hunted and offered as tribute. Behind him, a low growl rolled through the trees. Brutus had followed, crouched and ready. Mason whispered, "Not yet." But the creatures had already smelled them. Their heads snapped up, yellow eyes narrowing. The first spear flew past his shoulder, cutting the bark of a nearby tree. Mason fired back, blue light slicing through the air. One of the hunters fell, screaming. The rest charged. Brutus roared, a sound that shook the ground, and leapt into the clearing. What followed wasn't a fight, it was slaughter. The predator tore through the hunters like a storm, claws flashing, teeth snapping. Mason fired at anything that moved, covering Brutus's side. When it was over, the clearing was silent except for the heavy sound of breathing. Brutus stood beside him, blood dripping from its jaw, eyes wild. Mason lowered his weapon slowly. "Easy," he said, voice low. The predator froze, then backed away a step, chest heaving. It understood his tone. He approached one of the fallen hunters. Around its neck hung a chain with small metallic cubes, each cube engraved with alien symbols. He turned one over and froze. On the underside was a human mark, the insignia of his own exploration team. These hunters had been scavenging their dead. Mason clenched his fist. "They weren't the monsters," he whispered. "We were the invaders." He buried the badges, marking the spot with a broken spear. Brutus watched quietly, then pushed a pawful of leaves over the grave as if helping. Mason looked at it, half smiling through exhaustion. Guess we're both stuck here now, or da-ba. The next few days, they traveled deeper into the heart of Deathworld 9. The jungle began to change. The plants grew taller, glowing with faint energy. Strange symbols appeared carved into rocks, the same kind the hunters used. It was a warning, but also a path. One night, Mason woke to find Brutus staring toward the darkness beyond their campfire. Something huge moved out there, bigger than anything they had seen yet. A deep vibration rolled through the ground. Brutus growled softly, stepping forward, fur standing on end. Mason stood beside him, rifle ready. The shadows shifted, and two glowing red eyes blinked open in the dark. The sound that followed wasn't a roar. It was speech, slow, heavy, and ancient. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. A challenge. Brutus snarled, stepping between Mason and the shape. The jungle fell silent. For the first time since landing on Deathworld 9, Mason realized something terrifying. Brutus wasn't the top predator, and whatever ruled this planet had just noticed them. The night was alive with sound, but every noise felt wrong, like the jungle itself was holding its breath. Mason stood motionless beside the fire, his hand tight on the rifle. Brutus stayed low, muscles coiled, eyes fixed on the darkness where that deep, ancient voice had come from. The forest glowed faintly blue around them, mist curling through the roots like smoke from an invisible fire. Something moved. Not walking, flowing. The shadows folded apart, revealing a creature that made even Brutus seem small. Its skin shimmered, like polished stone, shifting color with each breath. 6 eyes burned faint red in the gloom, and a crown of glowing vines wrapped around its head like living armor. Mason took a step back. He had seen predators, soldiers, monsters, but this thing was older, wiser. The jungle didn't fight against it. It bowed. Brutus let out a low rumble, half warning, half challenge. The creature answered with a voice that was almost a whisper, yet carried through the trees. Mason couldn't understand the words, but he felt the meaning. A question, maybe even curiosity. He lowered his rifle slowly and pointed to himself. "Human," he said, his voice barely above the hum of insects. Then he gestured toward Brutus. "Friend." The creature tilted its head, eyes blinking one by one. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, it lowered itself to the ground. The vines around its body shifted color from red to deep green. The jungle seemed to relax with it. Brutus stopped growling. Mason exhaled. "All right," he muttered. "Guess that means we're not dinner." The creature extended one long, clawed hand toward the firelight. Its palm opened, revealing small metallic shards, fragments of human technology, broken and scorched. Mason recognized the pieces, his team's communication array. It placed them gently on the ground between them, then backed away, eyes still locked on his. Mason crouched, touching one of the shards. It was hot, though the fire hadn't reached it. A strange humming came from inside, faint but steady. He looked back up. "You want me to fix this?" he asked, half joking. The creature blinked again, once, slowly. Agreement. He worked through the night, patching the pieces together with what tools he had left. The predator watched, silent and patient, like a teacher waiting for a student to understand. Brutus sat close by, keeping the darkness at bay. Hours later, Mason connected the last wire. The device sparked to life, showing a flicker of light across its cracked surface. A hologram burst out, his ship's last transmission. Static, voices shouting, then an explosion. The signal cut off. Mason stared at it, realizing the truth. The jungle hadn't destroyed the explorers. The council had abandoned them. The rescue never came because they were written off, expendable. He felt anger burn in his chest, stronger than fear. The great creature studied him, silent, reading every emotion. Then, in a single motion, it turned and began to walk into the deeper jungle, its massive shape blending into the glow. After a moment, Brutus nudged Mason's shoulder and followed. "Fine," Mason said under his breath. "I'm coming." They traveled for days through terrain no map had shown, valleys filled with glowing water, forests that sang in the wind. Everywhere they went, the jungle seemed to shift aside for the ancient being. Mason began to notice carvings on the rocks, drawings of humans, or something that looked like them, standing beside beasts, not fighting, working together. When they reached the base of a mountain, the creature stopped. It turned to Mason, then pointed one massive claw at the glowing symbols carved into the cliff. Mason stepped closer, brushing away moss. The carvings showed 12 figures entering the jungle, one standing at the end, surrounded by beasts. Above them, alien writing curved in a spiral. He didn't know what it meant, but he could feel it. It was prophecy. The creature lowered its head and gave a sound like thunder mixed with breath. Brutus echoed it softly, bowing his head too. Mason realized they were showing respect, not to him, but to the moment. Something had been fulfilled. As the creature turned to leave, Mason caught its gaze one last time. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Why help me?" It didn't answer in words. Instead, it pressed its hand against the earth. The ground shimmered, and the plants around them bloomed in seconds, flowers of fire and glass. Then it was gone, melting back into the forest's heart. Brutus stood beside Mason, calm again, eyes reflecting the strange flowers. Mason looked up at the endless green canopy and finally understood. The jungle wasn't a curse. It was a test, one that measured not strength, but connection. The man, who had come to study the Deathworld, had been turned into something else, something the jungle itself had accepted. And deep in the shadows, unseen by both man and beast, more eyes opened, watching, learning, waiting for the next move of the human who had earned the jungle's respect. Part 4 will unfold how the Galactic Council reacts to the human signal. Reactivating? And what happens when they try to reclaim a world that now belongs to something older and far less forgiving? The jungle slept under a heavy green mist when the first ship broke through the clouds. Mason saw it before he heard it. A dark shape gliding low, lights cutting through the fog like knives. He froze where he stood, Brutus beside him, both watching. The streak of metal descend toward the old crash site. So the council had finally decided to come back. Not to rescue, to recover. For a long time, Mason just listened to the distant hum of engines. Brutus tilted his head, uneasy. The animals in the forest went silent, the air tightening as if the planet itself held its breath. Mason knew what that silence meant: trouble. By nightfall, he saw the first patrol drones sweep across the treetops, silver eyes blinking, searching. He stayed hidden under the roots of a fallen tree, watching them drift by like ghosts. He recognized the design, his own ship's models now reprogrammed. The council had come to erase what was left of the expedition, to erase him. He waited until the last drone vanished, then whispered, "They think this world can be tamed." Brutus huffed, a deep growl vibrating through the ground. "Let's show them it can't." The next morning, they moved through the jungle toward the landing site. The path was lined with strange markings, the kind the ancient creature had carved into the stones. Mason traced them with his fingers. They pulsed faintly, alive. The jungle remembered. When they reached the clearing, he saw the council soldiers building a perimeter, dozens of them, armored and armed with plasma cannons. Machines buzzed, cutting vines, burning the soil. The air reeked of ozone and arrogance. One officer stood near the center, shouting orders. Mason recognized her voice from the transmission logs, Commander Valen. She had been the one who signed off their mission. She was also the one who abandoned them. He could have walked away. But the jungle didn't forgive, and neither did he. Mason signaled Brutus to circle wide. The predator melted into the foliage, silent and invisible. Mason crept closer, moving like the forest itself. He remembered every training drill, every survival tactic, but the jungle had taught him better ones. A soldier broke off from the group to scan the area. Mason waited until the man turned his back, then threw a stone across the clearing. When the soldier turned toward the sound, Mason moved, swift and low, grabbing him from behind and dragging him into the roots. A quick strike, quiet as breath. One down. Brutus struck next, a blur of muscle and claws, silent until it was too late. Two soldiers vanished before the others even realized what was happening. Then, chaos. The jungle came alive, trees swaying, vines whipping out like living ropes, roots cracking through the soil. The machines malfunctioned, lights flickering. Soldiers screamed into radios that no longer worked. Mason moved through the smoke and shadow, his rifle flashing blue light. Brutus roared, shaking the ground. When it ended, only the commander was left, cornered against a broken pod. She raised her weapon, hands trembling. "You're alive," she whispered. "We thought you were dead." Mason stepped forward, eyes cold. "You made sure of it." Valen lowered her gun slowly. "We had to quarantine the planet. You brought something dangerous." He glanced at Brutus, who stood behind him, breathing heavy but calm. "You mean him? He's not the danger. You are." Valen's voice cracked. "That thing killed 12. No," Mason interrupted. "This world killed 12 because they didn't listen. Because they came here thinking they could own it." He stepped closer, the glow from the jungle lighting his face. "I listened." The commander looked around, realizing the vines were slowly curling toward her feet. The jungle itself was watching. Mason turned away. "Leave. Tell the council this planet doesn't belong to them. It never did." She didn't argue. She just backed away toward her shuttle, eyes wide. When she was gone, the forest settled again, the mist folding back like a curtain. Mason exhaled, the tension in his shoulders fading. Brutus nudged his arm gently, a low sound rumbling in his chest. "Yeah," Mason said softly, resting a hand on the creature's head. "We did it." The jungle answered with a deep hum that rolled through the trees, almost like approval. Flowers bloomed in their wake as they walked back into the green heart of Deathworld 9. But far above them in orbit, another signal blinked. The council had heard the commander's report, and they were not going to leave quietly. The real war for Deathworld 9 had only just begun. The sky over Deathworld 9 burned red. Dozens of council warships hung above the clouds, their engines glowing like silent suns. Mason watched from a cliff as streaks of light descended, drop pods carrying troops, drones, and harvesters. The jungle below trembled. Trees folded their leaves as if bracing for pain. Beside him, Brutus paced restlessly, fur rippling, eyes locked on the sky. The predator could sense the invasion before Mason even spoke. "They're not leaving," Mason said quietly. "They're coming for everything." He had seen it before, on other worlds. When the council wanted a planet, it stripped it bare. But this time, they weren't just fighting nature. They were fighting something ancient, something alive. The first explosions lit up the horizon. Lines of flame cut across the forest as orbital cannons fired. Jungle towers collapsed, sending waves of mist into the air. The soldiers moved in formation, methodical and confident. To them, this was just another operation. To Deathworld 9, it was war. Mason turned to Brutus. "Time to show them what this planet can do." He ran downhill through the fog, the ground shaking beneath his feet. The jungle responded, roots shifting aside to clear his path, vines pulsing with light. It was as if the planet recognized his heartbeat. At the crash site, he found the old transmitter the ancient being had shown him. It still hummed faintly. Mason placed his hand on the center panel. The symbols flared to life, glowing in the same green light that ran through the jungle. A sound rose in the air, low, deep, and endless. The jungle awoke. Every tree, every creature, every crawling thing seemed to feel it. Birds screamed, roots split open the ground, and massive shapes began moving through the haze. The Deathworld's true guardians, the colossal predators that slept beneath the soil, were rising. Mason looked up as one of them appeared from the mist. Its body covered in thick moss and scales, eyes glowing with intelligence. Brutus stood beside it, tiny in comparison but unafraid. The beasts turned toward the distant flashes of council weapons. They didn't need orders. They knew. The human raised his rifle, more as a gesture than a weapon. "Let's end this." The jungle surged forward. Council soldiers screamed as the forest itself attacked. Roots impaling walkers, vines wrapping around dropships, tearing them apart mid-air. The ground split open, swallowing entire units. Predators charged from the fog, silent until impact, their roars shaking the earth. Mason moved through the chaos like part of the storm. He guided Brutus toward the command post, firing in short bursts, precise and calm. The soldiers barely saw him, a shadow among monsters. When he reached the command node, he found Commander Valen again, shouting into her headset. The ground around her trembled, monitors flickering red. She looked up, eyes wide, when Mason stepped through the smoke. "You can't stop this," she said. "You think you control it, but you're just another part of it now." Mason shook his head. "I don't control it. I listen to it." The wall behind her cracked as a massive claw tore through the structure. Brutus appeared, eyes burning, and roared. Valen dropped her weapon and ran. Mason didn't follow. He just looked at the destruction and felt no triumph, only balance. The jungle was reclaiming what had always been its own. The sky filled with fire as the council fleet began to retreat. Ships burned, falling like dying stars into the forest below. But the jungle didn't chase them. It stopped the moment the last one fled, like a heartbeat slowing after rage. Hours later, silence returned. The fires dimmed. The air smelled of rain and ash. Mason sat beside a stream, exhausted, watching Brutus drink. The predator's fur glowed faintly under the bioluminescent canopy. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "They'll be back one day." Brutus looked up, blinking slowly. "Yeah," Mason said with a tired smile. "And we'll be waiting." The jungle around them pulsed once, faintly alive as if agreeing. In that silence, with the ruins of an empire smoldering on the horizon, a single human and his predator companion sat side by side, not as conquerors, not as monsters, but as guardians of a living world that had finally chosen them. And somewhere deep beneath the soil, the ancient voice stirred once more, low, proud, and content. The Deathworld had survived. Weeks passed. The jungle healed faster than any world had a right to. Burned trees grew new shoots. Rivers that ran black now shimmered blue again. The air no longer smelled of smoke, but of wet earth and life. Deathworld 9 had survived the invasion, and it remembered who had fought for it. Mason lived in the ruins of the old camp. The metal walls were wrapped in vines now, humming softly with energy from the planet. He didn't call it home, but it was peace. Every morning, Brutus disappeared into the mist to hunt, and always came back before nightfall, dropping food beside the fire like a loyal shadow. Sometimes it was fruit, sometimes meat. Once even a handful of glowing stones that pulsed faintly, as if they were hearts. Mason spent his days repairing what little technology still worked. He built small signal beacons, not to call for rescue, but to listen, to know if the galaxy dared return. And it did. Transmissions flickered through static. Council voices, sharp and fearful. They spoke his name as if it were a warning. The Deathworld incident. The human survivor. Rumors spread across star systems. A man who had walked into a world that killed 12 elite explorers and came back leading its apex predator. A man who commanded a living planet. Mason smiled the first time he heard it. "Commanded," he whispered. "No one commands Deathworld 9. That night, the ancient creature returned, the same one crowned with vines and glowing eyes. It stood on the ridge above the camp, massive and silent. The jungle glowed with it, every leaf catching its light. Brutus lifted his head but didn't growl. Mason rose slowly, meeting its gaze. No words passed between them. None were needed. The creature lowered its head, a gesture of respect, then turned and vanished into the trees. The ground shook softly as it moved away, and Mason understood. The jungle had chosen its guardian. He was no longer a visitor. He was part of its story now. When the next survey ship entered orbit months later, its scanners detected something impossible. A massive life signature covering the entire planet, pulsing like one heartbeat. The crew saw lights moving in the forest patterns, too organized to be natural. Then the signal cut out. No transmission ever came back. The council called the planet forbidden. From then on, travelers spoke of the Deathworld with both fear and reverence. They said the jungle itself moved at night. They said a beast with glowing eyes prowled the trees, and beside it walked a man who fed it from his hand. Some said he could speak to the world itself. Some said he was the world. But the truth was simpler. Mason had just learned what most of the galaxy never would. That survival wasn't about domination. It was about respect, about balance, about standing beside something greater and not flinching. As dusk fell across Deathworld 9, Mason sat by the fire, breaking bread with Brutus. The wind carried strange songs through the leaves, voices of creatures hidden deep within the forest. He looked out at the endless jungle and felt something close to peace. No banners, no empires, no orders, just life, wild, dangerous, and free. The galaxy might fear Deathworld 9 forever, but for one human and one predator, it had become home.